The snowstorm did not fall in flakes but in veils, a curtain of white that blurred horizon and sky, burying the earth in silence. Barbara Whitfield leaned into the wind, her shawl drawn tight around shoulders that had once carried baskets of corn, laundry for 7, the weight of a husband's anger, and then the quiet of his grave. At 58 her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had turned silver white, a banner of age the townsfolk never let her forget. She stumbled up the frozen rise toward the glow of firelight in a window, her voice rasping against the storm as if it could break before it reached the door. "I am too old, sir, but I can cook." Her words were a plea and a confession, lost almost at once to the wind. She pressed her knuckles to the heavy timber door, uncertain whether she hoped for silence or answer. The townspeople had made it clear. She was no woman for a man, no prospect, no prize. They had whispered behind her in the trading post, their mouths pinched with scorn. "She's half a ghost," Martha Riley had sneered just last week, stacking her bolts of cloth high to keep Barbara from reaching. Too old for new love. Too useless for work. Better she fade into the church pews. The door opened. A rush of heat rolled out, mingled with the scent of pine logs and venison stew. She blinked against it, half blind from snow glare, and found herself staring up at a man carved out of both storm and stone. Chenoa, the Apache giant, stood tall and broad, his hair loose across his shoulders, his chest marked by scars not hidden by the wool blanket slung about him. 32 at most, his eyes burned dark and calm, as if storms belonged to him alone. Barbara's breath caught, not with desire but with shame. Beside his youth and his strength, she felt the brittle lines of her face deepen. She bowed her head, ready to be dismissed. "I can cook," she repeated, quieter now, her voice trembling like the wick of a lantern. "That's all I can offer." He studied her in silence. Snow hissed at their feet, melting where the fire's warmth stretched. His gaze did not laugh, nor sneer, nor soften. It was steady, unreadable, like river stones under frost. With a motion as simple as breathing, he stepped aside. Barbara entered. Inside, the cabin was spare. Plank walls sealed against drafts, a table carved rough, pelts scattered near the hearth. She stood awkwardly in the middle, snow dripping from her shawl, feeling the silence press in. In another life, she might have kept walking, offering only thanks. But the storm was too fierce, the night too long, and she was too tired to keep proving to the world she could survive without kindness. Her hands, reddened by cold, moved toward the fire. She laid them near the flames, and for the first time in months, warmth reached bone. The ache brought tears, though she hid them, blinking quickly. Chenoa sat across the hearth, silent still, his knife tracing shavings from a block of cedar. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she had come. He watched her as one watches a deer that has stepped into the clearing, measuring whether it will flee or stay. Barbara thought of town again, of Martha's sharp tongue, of Deputy Jennings' laugh when he called her grandmother. Even Elias Boone, kindly though he was, had spoken in pity rather than regard. All her life she had worked, cooking for miners, washing linens, nursing neighbors. Yet now she was treated as though her years had stripped her of value. She wanted only a place where her hands still mattered. Her voice broke the silence. "I can make bread from scraps. Stretch meat till it feeds 3 instead of 1. If you'll let me stay till morning, I'll prove it." Chenoa's eyes flickered to the iron pot above the fire. Slowly he gestured. The motion was not command, nor invitation, but space given. She understood. Barbara rose, her movement stiff, and searched the shelves. She found dried beans, a bone with scraps of venison, a twist of herbs. With practiced hands, she stirred, measured, crushed leaves between her palms to release their faint fragrance. The work steadied her. Here, in the rhythm of cooking, she was not ghost nor joke, but woman, needed, useful, alive. When the stew thickened, she ladled it into a wooden bowl and set it before him. He accepted without word, tasting, then laying the spoon down. His gaze met hers, steady still, but something had shifted, respect or recognition, she could not name. Barbara lowered herself back near the fire, exhaustion tugging at her bones. For a moment, peace brushed against her like the edge of a quilt. She dared to imagine belonging, not as wife, not as beauty, but as hands that made a home out of storm. Yet the memory of scorn returned sharp. Too old, too useless. She bent her head, her white hair falling forward, ashamed of even the flicker of hope. The storm outside thickened, wind rattling the shutters. Chenoa rose, crossing to the door. He bolted it firmly, then returned to place another log on the fire. He sat again, knife idle now, and spoke for the first time. "Storm long," he said, his English rough but clear. His voice was low, steady as earth. "You stay." The words fell like stones in still water. Not a question, not pity but fact. Barbara's breath faltered. The warmth of the hearth touched her face, but another warmth, unexpected, unearned, stirred within. She nodded, unable to find reply. Outside, the snow sang against the cabin, endless and cold. Inside, two strangers sat in silence, fire between them. One felt her shame still heavy, yet for the first time in years it was not all she carried. In the quiet, Chenoa leaned closer to the flames, whispering words in his own tongue, words she could not understand. The sound was reverent, almost a prayer. Barbara listened, her heart unmoored, wondering if he spoke of storms, of ancestors, or of her. And though she told herself she was too old for such foolishness, her chest tightened, as if the world she thought finished had just begun to stir again. The storm eased after 3 long days, leaving the world buried in silence. Snowbanks rose higher than fence rails, and roofs wore white crowns that glittered under a pale sun. Barbara walked with careful steps down the road that led into town, her shawl pinned tight at her throat, her cheeks raw from wind. She carried an empty sack beneath her arm, though she knew the flour she meant to buy would be costly. Each crunch of her boots on packed snow felt like a drum announcing her presence. Already, she could feel the eyes that would follow. Inside the trading post, the air smelled of kerosene, dry beans, and wet wool. The stove hissed in the corner, a black belly radiating heat that never quite touched the corners. Women gathered near bolts of cloth, their voices sharp as needles. Men stamped their boots and slapped hands for warmth, their words riding smoke from cheap cigars. Barbara stepped across the threshold, and the hum lowered just enough for her to notice. Martha Riley turned first. Her fox fur collar sat stiff around a neck that bent like a knife toward Barbara. "Well, look who braved the snow," she said, her tone coated in honey that could not hide the acid. "I'd have thought a woman of your years would know better than to risk the cold. Not worth breaking bones no one will mend." The women around her tittered, their laughter snapping quick as twigs. Barbara felt the flush rise hot beneath her pale skin. She moved to the shelves, fingers trembling as she reached for a small sack of flour. Deputy Carl Jennings leaned by the stove, boots crossed, his badge catching the glow. He was a man who enjoyed being the loudest voice in a room. "Careful, Miss Whitfield," he called, grinning wide. "That flour's for families. Not much sense a grandmother taking up good supplies." A ripple of laughter followed. Barbara gripped the sack tighter, her throat thick. She wanted to speak, to tell them she had as much right to bread as any of them, but her voice seemed locked behind her teeth. Elias Boone shifted near the counter. His hair was gray, his back bent, his eyes soft with pity. "Let her be," he muttered. "She pays same coin as the rest." His words were quiet, meant more for conscience than defense, but still the room fell a notch quieter. Barbara placed her coins on the counter with care. They clinked too loudly in the hush. The shopkeeper swept them up quickly, eager to move on. She tucked the flour into her sack, each gesture slow, measured, as though control might preserve her dignity. As she turned to leave, Martha's voice chased her. "She spends her nights with that Apache now, or haven't you heard? Storm or no storm, a woman ought to know better. Age doesn't grant decency, it seems." The words struck deeper than the cold. Barbara did not pause, did not look back. She stepped into the white glare of day, her body taut, her breath cutting sharp. The sack of flour weighed little, yet her arms ached as if burdened by stone. On the walk back, the hush of snow pressed heavy. The sound of gossip lingered louder than the crunch of her boots. Each step was filled with shame. How quickly the town had carved a story for her, one she had no chance to deny. She had not even spoken more than a handful of words to Chenoa, yet already their tongues had bound her name to him, mocking both. Back at the cabin, smoke curled from the chimney. The sight steadied her heart, though shame followed close. Inside, warmth wrapped her shoulders. Chenoa sat by the fire, sharpening a blade with patient strokes. He looked up as she entered, eyes flicking briefly to the sack she carried, then back to her face. Barbara busied herself removing her shawl, setting the flower aside. She did not want him to ask. She did not want him to know what they had said. But silence pressed too hard. "They talk," she whispered, kneeling near the fire. Her voice cracked. "They say I have no place. That I should have faded already. That I—" she faltered, her eyes burning. Chenoa set the blade down. He did not reach for her, did not offer the empty comfort of words. Instead, he leaned forward and nudged the log in the hearth with iron tongs, sending sparks leaping like stars. The fire flared, throwing warmth across her hands. She watched the flames, and slowly her breathing steadied. His silence was not indifference. It was space, given freely, without judgment. It was permission to speak without fear of answer. Her hands, pale and lined, folded in her lap. She stared at them as though they belonged to someone else. "Even my husband," she murmured, "said I was fading. And when he died, I believed him. I thought maybe I was already half gone. But you—" Her words trailed, ashamed of their weight. Chenoa's gaze did not falter. He took the wooden bowl from the table and filled it with stew, setting it before her. His hand lingered on the rim for a moment before withdrawing. Not command, not pity, acknowledgement. Barbara swallowed hard, the knot in her throat easing though no words had been spoken. She took the bowl, lifting it carefully, feeling steadier simply because he had placed it in her hands. That night, as wind scraped faint against the shutters, Barbara lay awake on the cot near the hearth. She replayed every word from town, every sneer, every pitying glance. Yet they rang differently now, muted by the memory of silence beside the fire, by the weight of a bowl set gently before her. Perhaps the townsfolk saw her as faded. Perhaps they always would. But here in the glow of pine logs, she was not invisible. She was seen, not for her hair nor her age, but for the simple act of enduring, of cooking, of being present in the storm. Her eyes closed slowly, a fragile peace brushing against her. Yet just before sleep took her, she heard him. Chenoa whispered again in his tongue, low and steady, his words like smoke winding toward the rafters. She did not know their meaning, but something in them carried her name. She was sure of it. Her heart lifted, fragile but fierce. For the first time in years, she did not dream of endings, but of beginnings she could not yet name. The storm lingered like a memory that refused to fade, though the worst of its fury had passed. Snow lay in deep drifts against the cabin walls, muffling the world into a hush that felt both sheltering and suffocating. Inside, days began to follow a rhythm, unspoken, steady, fragile as frost on glass. Barbara woke early, her breath misting in the cold that clung before the fire caught. Her hands, though stiff with age, moved deftly to coax flame from embers. She stirred beans or kneaded dough from scraps, each task done with quiet determination. It was the only way she knew to push back against uselessness, to prove with every small act that she still belonged to life. Chenoa moved about the cabin with a silence that was not absence but presence distilled. He carved wood, mended harness, stacked logs in neat rows, his movements measured, deliberate. The muscles across his back flexed with each stroke of the axe, his skin bronzed even under winter's pale light. Barbara tried not to watch too long, ashamed of the quickening in her chest, yet unable to deny the strange warmth that flickered there. They rarely spoke. Words felt clumsy, unnecessary, compared to the gestures that passed between them. When Barbara cooked, Chenoa set her chair nearer the fire without a word. When he carried in water, he left the bucket just close enough that she would not need to bend too far. Their silences wove together like threads, not binding yet not breaking either. Still, the weight of gossip clung to Barbara like a second shawl. At night, when she lay on her cot and listened to the wind claw at the shutters, she heard Martha Riley's mocking voice, Carl Jennings' sneering laugh. Too old. Too useless. Their judgment rang sharper because a part of her believed it. She was ashamed of how desperately she wanted this shelter, ashamed of how her heart steadied in his presence. On the fourth morning, Barbara ventured outside with a basket, determined to gather herbs she had spotted near the frozen creek. Chenoa had gone to check his snares, and she thought to surprise him with something fresh for stew. But the snow was deep, and her boots heavy. Halfway back, her breath came ragged, her legs trembling. She stumbled, the basket spilling, herbs scattering across the white. She sank to her knees, hands pressed into the drift. For a moment, despair surged. Was Martha right? Was she a fool? Too old to be useful, nothing but a burden even here? The wind cut across her face, searing her with its cold. She bent her head, tears freezing before they could fall. Footsteps pressed into the snow behind her. Chenoa's shadow fell across the ground. He said nothing as he crouched, gathering the scattered herbs with large, careful hands. His breath came in clouds, steady, controlled. When he rose, he extended the basket toward her. She stared at it, her pride warring with shame. But his eyes, dark, unreadable, held no mockery. Only patience. She took the basket. He reached down then, lifting her arm, guiding her to her feet with a strength that was both gentle and unyielding. For one suspended moment, her hand remained in his, and she felt her pulse hammer against skin that had long been quiet. They walked back together. No word passed between them, yet something had shifted. The silence no longer felt like distance but like shelter, wide enough to hold both their doubts. That evening, Deputy Jennings rode up, his horse snorting steam. He dismounted with a swagger, stamping his boots loud against the snow. He pushed into the cabin without waiting for answer, the smell of whiskey sharp around him. "Well, if this ain't cozy," he drawled, his eyes sliding over Barbara, then to Chenoa. "Town's been whispering plenty. Widow Whitfield shacking up in a savage's hut, what a tale that makes." His grin widened, cruel. "Guess desperate times call for desperate company." Barbara's face burned, her shame raw, exposed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The years of scorn had stolen her voice too well. Chenoa rose, tall as the cabin roof would allow. He did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he stepped between Barbara and Jennings, his presence filling the room with a weight that silenced even the deputy's grin. Jennings chuckled uneasily, adjusting his coat. "Careful now. I was only talking." He backed toward the door, muttering about town business, before disappearing into the storm's fading light. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the pop of the fire. Barbara sat trembling, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles ached. She expected anger from Chenoa, perhaps even scorn of his own. But instead he turned and slowly, deliberately, took her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, firm. Her breath caught. She dared a glance upward, meeting his eyes. They did not pity. They did not burn with judgment. They held her as the fire did. Steady, unwavering, enough to thaw what she had thought forever frozen. That night, Barbara lay awake long after Chenoa's breathing had slowed into sleep. Her heart moved with a restless rhythm she had not known in years. She turned her face toward the rafters, whispering into the dark, "Maybe I am not invisible." The words felt dangerous, fragile as new glass. The fire dimmed, embers glowing faint. Outside, wolves howled somewhere beyond the frozen hills. Yet within, the cabin felt less like a refuge of chance, and more like the beginning of something unnamed. As her eyes drifted shut, she saw again the moment in the snow, his hand steadying hers, lifting her without question. It burned brighter than the cruel laughter in town. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not if she deserved it, but what it might mean if he had chosen to give it. And just before sleep claimed her, the memory of his hand on hers flared again, as if it had been more than a gesture, perhaps the first quiet vow of something yet to come. The thaw began slowly, snow softening along the edges of fence posts, trickling into rivulets that cut through drifts. Yet the air still bit sharp, and the townsfolk's whispers carried colder than any wind. Barbara felt them whenever she entered the square. The weight of eyes that turned too quickly away, the smothered laughs, the barbed phrases that seemed flung like stones at her back. "She should have stayed alone," Martha Riley hissed one morning near the well, her voice pitched to Carrie. "It's indecent. A woman her age playing at marriage. Nothing left of her but gray hair and worn hands." Barbara's breath caught, her pale trembling against the rope. She wanted to defend herself, to shout that she had never sought marriage, never claimed more than firelight and shelter. But shame sealed her lips. Even when Elias Boone passed by with his wagon and gave her a look of sympathy, the kindness only deepened the wound. Pity was still a form of exile. That evening, back at the cabin, Chenoa returned with a shallow cut across his arm from setting a trap. It was nothing grave, but Barbara felt purpose flood her veins as she boiled water, tore clean strips of cloth, and searched the snow-packed earth for herbs she knew to dull infection. Her fingers stung with cold, but she pressed on, determined to offer what she could. When she bound the wound, Chenoa's gaze followed her face with unflinching steadiness. His breath was even, his silence patient, as if he recognized the fire beneath her trembling hands. "You endure storms," he said at last, his voice low, accented but clear. "Not just this." He lifted his bandaged arm. "You endure people." The words struck her deeper than she expected. She bent her head, blinking hard, for no one had spoken of her endurance as worth. Not since her children left, not since her husband's last breath. She had carried survival like a burden, never as a crown. But the gossip grew louder. Carl Jennings stopped her in the street a week later, his badge catching sunlight. "Town's restless," he warned, though his smirk betrayed more delight than concern. "They don't like the picture of you playing house with a savage. Folks say it's shameful. Might be better you went back to living quiet." Barbara's throat tightened. She clutched her shawl as if it could shield her from his words. Before she could answer, Chenoa appeared at her side, silent as shadow. He stepped close enough that Jennings' grin faltered. Without a word, Chenoa guided Barbara away, his hand resting at the small of her back. That single touch steadied her heart more than any defense might have. That night, though, shame weighed heavier than the quilt she pulled over herself. She rose before dawn, packing a small bundle of bread and cloth, convinced she must leave before she ruined him with her presence. She thought of Martha's sharp eyes, Jennings' sneer, the whispers that followed like hounds. She could not bear to be the reason he was ridiculed. Snow crunched behind her before she had left the clearing. Chenoa's voice called her name, low but commanding, and she froze. She turned, clutching the bundle like a thief. "You leave?" he asked. The question was simple, but his eyes held depth that rooted her in place. Her lips parted, trembling. "I don't belong here. I am too old to shadow your life. They say I shame you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and tears stung her eyes, sharp as winter wind. Chenoa stepped forward. He unfastened the heavy cloak from his shoulders and draped it across hers with deliberate care, his hands lingering just long enough to anchor her. The weight of it silenced her protests. "You are not shame," he said. His voice carried the certainty of stone. "You are fire. You cook, you mend, you keep breath alive when storms try to kill it. That is worth." The words shattered something within her, breaking open a well she had buried beneath years of silence. She pressed her face into the fur lining of the cloak, her tears soaking it. For the first time, she let herself believe she was not merely enduring but offering. The next day, Elias Boone arrived with a cart of kindling. He watched as Barbara carried baskets from the cabin, her hair catching sun like silver threads. He cleared his throat, then glanced at Chenoa. "Town says she's nothing but a servant to you," he said cautiously. His tone carried no malice, only curiosity, as if hoping for reassurance. Chenoa stood tall, his dark eyes steady. He glanced at Barbara, then back to Boone. His words came firm, each syllable weighted. "Not servant. Wife." Barbara froze, the basket slipping slightly in her grasp. The air seemed to still, even the wind pausing at the threshold of the cabin. Boone's brows rose, his weathered face registering surprise, then something softer, respect. Barbara's breath caught. She had never heard the word placed upon her with such calm finality, not since her youth, and never with such quiet honor. She turned toward Chenoa, her heart pounding, unsure whether to protest or to fall into the truth of it. The town would not believe. Martha would spit venom, Jennings would mock louder. But in that moment, with Elias Boone as witness and the snow gleaming at their feet, Chenoa had named her not as burden, not as shadow, but as chosen. Her hands trembled around the basket, yet within her chest, something steadied at last. The sky was iron gray, swollen with storm once more, and the air trembled with the promise of violence. Snow swept the horizon in ghostly swirls, erasing the line between earth and heaven. In the center of town, where the wind clawed through alleys and whipped across the square, Barbara Whitfield stood with her shawl pulled tight around her, her hair streaming like silver fire against the storm. Her face was pale, but her eyes, for the first time in years, held a steady flame. The townsfolk had gathered in clusters, their voices sharp, their breaths fogging the air. Martha Riley's shrill tongue cut loudest of all. Shameful, I say. A woman of her years parading about as if she were a bride. What man would stoop so low but one outside decency itself? Her words were met with nods, mutters of agreement. Others shifted uneasily, torn between curiosity and cruelty, pity and disdain. Deputy Carl Jennings stood tall near the church steps, his coat collar high, his badge flashing like ice. He looked upon Barbara with a smirk that spread wide, the grin of a man certain of his authority. "Town won't have it," Jennings declared, his voice carrying over the gale. "A white-haired widow playing wife to a savage. It's indecent, dangerous. Folks are restless. For the sake of order, this ends tonight." Barbara felt the crowd's eyes pierce her like needles. Shame surged hot through her chest, the old familiar weight threatening to crush her. For a moment she thought to bow her head, to retreat as she always had. But her feet held fast, rooted as if the snow itself had frozen her into place. The bundle of scorn and whispers she had carried all her life threatened to burst, yet she clenched her hands tight, willing her heart to beat through it. Then the storm shifted, parting like a curtain, and he appeared. Chenoa strode through the snow with the steadiness of a man who did not yield to wind or judgment. His blanket fell from one shoulder, bearing the carved lines of his chest. The scars that spoke of battles survived. His hair whipped dark across his face, but his eyes, black and unwavering, cut through the crowd like fire through brush. Each step seemed to silence a whisper, each breath steadied the air. The townsfolk parted unwillingly, as if their bodies betrayed their fear, even as their mouths clung to mockery. Jennings bristled, hand twitching near his belt, but he held his ground, his grin tightening with bravado. Barbara's breath caught as Chenoa came to stand beside her, tall and unmovable, the snow swirling about them both. He did not speak at once. His silence pressed heavier than any accusation. At last he turned, his voice low yet carrying through the storm. "Barbara Whitfield is mine," he said, each word slow, carved from stone. "She is fire in this storm. I chose her." The square rippled with gasps, mutters, disbelief. Martha Riley spat into the snow, her face twisted with venom. "Chose her? She's an old woman. A ghost clinging to life. You could have anyone, yet you take her? It's madness." Barbara flinched, her shame clawing to the surface. But before it could consume her, Chenoa's hand found hers. His fingers wrapped steady, warm, unyielding. The gesture burned brighter than the storm, brighter than their scorn. He turned his gaze back to the crowd. "You call her old. I call her strong. You call her useless. I call her the one who keeps breath alive when storms would kill it. I do not need your permission." His voice cracked like thunder, not in volume but in certainty. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the wind's howl. Jennings stepped forward, his smirk sharpening into threat. "This town has its laws. We won't have this mockery of marriage. You bring shame here, both of you." He moved closer, his eyes flicking toward Barbara, cold and dismissive. "Step aside, ma'am, before you're dragged down with him." Something inside Barbara stirred then, something that had long slept beneath years of scorn and grief. For too long she had let others speak over her, define her, reduce her. But Chenoa's hand in hers, the weight of his words spoken before them all, lit a fire that would not be smothered. Her voice rang clear, trembling but fierce. "I may be old," she said, her silver hair whipping wild in the stormlight. "But I am not nothing. You will not name me as shame. I am his choice, and he is mine." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Surprise, discomfort, perhaps even respect. Jennings sneered, stepping closer still, his jaw tight. But Chenoa shifted, placing his broad frame between them, shielding her. His presence radiated warning, the kind that needed no weapon. For a long, taut moment, the storm seemed to pause, the square holding its breath. Then Jennings, sensing the weight of silence, spat into the snow and barked a laugh. "Fools, both of you! You'll regret this." He turned on his heel, striding away. His bravado cracked though his pride refused to show it. Martha Riley hissed one last insult, but it faltered as she saw the crowd's shifting faces. Some ashamed, some thoughtful, none as quick to echo her now. Slowly, uneasily, the townsfolk dispersed, the storm swallowing their shapes into white. At last, the square was empty but for them. Barbara stood trembling, her heart hammering as if it might burst. Chenoa did not release her hand. He turned to her, his gaze softer now, though still unwavering. "You spoke," he said simply. Tears blurred her eyes. She nodded, her lips parting, but no words came. The fire inside her was too new, too raw, to be shaped into language. Instead, she let the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his gaze, speak what she could not. They walked back through the storm together, side by side, their footsteps carving a single path through the drifts. The wind clawed at them, but it felt less cruel now, less like an enemy and more like a witness. Inside the cabin, the fire still glowed, waiting. Barbara sank near it, her hands stretched to the flames, her breath unsteady. Chenoa knelt beside her, his presence close, his silence deep. He reached forward, placing his hand over hers on the hearth. In that gesture lay a vow, not spoken, not sealed by church or law, but carved into the marrow of two souls who had endured storms apart, and now would endure them together. Barbara closed her eyes, letting the warmth flood her. For the first time in decades, she did not feel invisible. She felt chosen. She felt alive. The storm outside roared on, but within the cabin, the quiet was shelter, and the fire burned brighter than it had before. And in the hush, as snow rattled faint against the shutters, Barbara whispered, not to him, not even to herself, but to the air that had once carried only shame, "I am worth something." The words trembled like new light breaking the horizon, fragile yet certain. Perhaps the town would never see her as more than a faded woman. Perhaps whispers would chase her until her last breath. But it no longer mattered. She had stood in the storm, and she had spoken, and he had chosen her before them all. She turned her face toward Chenoa, who watched her with that steady gaze, and the storm's howl seemed to soften, as if even the wind bowed to the truth of it. For when two souls stand together against the world's scorn, even snowlight cannot erase their fire. And if you are listening now, dear one, let this truth rest in your heart. Worth is not measured by youth, nor by beauty, nor by the approval of those who whisper behind closed doors. Worth is measured by the hand that reaches for yours when storms rise, by the voice that calls you chosen when others call you nothing. If you find that hand, that voice, that shelter, hold fast and do not let go.